Lois, shalom, shalom, Shabbat shalom, and welcome.
Shalom. Thank you for inviting me to speak.
We are thrilled to have you here today. We're thrilled to be able to begin to honor and to reuse this scroll. Can you tell us a little bit about the project that you've been involved of? You're a trustee of what's called the Memorial Scroll Trust. So can you tell us a little bit about what that project is, please?
Sure. So the Memorial Scrolls Trust is a London-based charity, and our mission is to take care of 1,500 Torah scrolls that survived the Shoah by being collected and hidden in Prague. And after the war, they were brought to London, and we dispersed 1,400 of them around the world. So they are on almost every continent. They're in Reform, conservative, Orthodox Jewish organizations, in schools and libraries, in museums. We have 1,000 here in the US, and we have 450 in the New York metropolitan area.
Fantastic. Now, I understand that in April in New York, there's going to be a special ceremony. We're going to be marking the 60th anniversary of the Sifrei Torah being loaned out. So I'm doing a little math, and I'm saying to myself, well, if these scrolls were lost at the time of the Shoah, right? So why is it that we're only marking 60 years and not 80? Can you help us a little bit with the math here?
Sure. So let me back up and tell you a little bit more about the story of how the scroll collection and this one, your oldest congregant, this congregant is 150 years old. So I don't think anybody here beats that.
There are a couple.
And so thank you, Rabbi, for laying the groundwork. So you saved me a lot of words that I won't have to say. So there were 1,000 years of history in this part of Central Europe. The Czech lands, Czechoslovakia, which was created after World War I, sits right in the center of Europe, not Eastern Europe. It's surrounded by Germany and Austria, and it does border Poland, but way off to the east. That means that the Jews in these lands, especially around 1900 and beyond, had a lot more to do with German Jews and Viennese Jews than they did the shtetl Jews in Eastern Europe of Poland and Lithuania. So a magical thing happened in these lands in the mid-19th century. About 1848, under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Jews were given citizenship. Prior to that, the Jews were invited in, kicked out of all these little villages, depending on the whims of the rulers. But in the mid-19th century, the Jews as citizens could attend university. They left the clogged and overcrowded Jewish areas in Prague and Brno and spread out all around the countryside of the Czech lands of the ancient kingdoms of Bohemia and Moravia. So there were more than 350 little towns that had little congregations in small shuls just like this one. And on Shabbat, they would gather together. Over time, they were very Orthodox originally, but over time they became assimilated and progressive. They adopted Reform Judaism from Germany, and they would have egalitarian services. The women and the men would dress like the regular citizens of the land, and they spoke German, and then later on Czech, not Yiddish. So that's the lay of the land. And then unfortunately, we know that the Nazi Party rose to power through the 1930s in Germany. And sure enough, by 1939, invaded the Bohemian and Moravian lands on their way to Poland. But because the people in this area of Central Europe had so much to do with the German population, life for the Jews between 1939 and 1941 in occupied Prague was not like it was in Warsaw. So let me turn the tables a little bit for what you might think of is going on. The Jews slowly lost some privileges, but they were allowed to live in their homes in all those little towns. They even were allowed to continue to have services. And when the Nazi officer in Prague got his orders that he needed to be roughing up the Jewish community a little bit, he asked the Jewish community of Prague to send a letter to all those little villages to collect their silver ornaments, because that's really what the Nazis were interested in, the silver and the ancient manuscripts in libraries, because 1,000 years of Jewish thought and history was collected. They were not originally interested in Torah scrolls, only in the books. So the Jewish community sent a letter, and from all of these hundreds of towns came boxes to Prague. Where in Prague? the Jewish Museum that was started in 1906, the third Jewish museum on the planet Earth. And the curators there started to collect the books and catalog and fill out little cards about what it was. And that is the beginning of our story, because a lot of the Jews in Prague were part of the resistance movement. And they realized that if they could collect all the movable Judaica at the time that the Jews began to be deported, so now we're already into 1941, 42, that we could save a lot of the artifacts. They didn't know what was going to happen. And quite frankly, they thought this was temporary and that they could collect all these things for safekeeping. And 6 months, a year, 2 years later, when the Jews came back to the towns, they could give the collections back out. So they wrote a second letter, the Jews, and they said, send us everything. Now, why did the SS officer let them do that? It's because the SS officer himself, as a personality, thought that he was a historian about ancient books, and he was not interested in all of this other junk. So the curator said, well, if you let us get everything and pilfer through it, we can give you the best things. We read Hebrew, we know about traditions. And by the way, Mr. SS officer, if you want, we can use our museum and make exhibitions of the ancient books we've already collected, and you can invite your SS officers to view this special thing. So imagine, in the front of the museum, the curators are creating an exhibition for the SS. And in the back of the museum, cart after cart after cart of Judaica is coming in, and many, many people were feverishly filling out index cards about what it was. What came? Torah scrolls and candlesticks and prayer books and pews and all kinds of Judaica like you can't imagine. Over the course of less than 1 year, they collected 200,000 items that were meticulously cataloged and put away for safekeeping. Unfortunately, by the end of that year, even the curators of that museum were sent off to Terezin and then on to the death camps. That's miracle number one. Miracle number two, at the end of the war, we know 6 million were killed. Unfortunately, 85% of the Czech Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Only a few thousand people straggled back into Prague. One of those people happened to be one of the collectors and curators of the Jewish Museum. And she knew exactly where everything had been stored away. And no bombs fell on Prague during the war. That's super important. Warsaw was flattened. Dresden was flattened. Berlin was flattened. Prague stands. And if any of you have traveled there, you know there's a very vibrant Jewish quarter. In fact, I'm noticing you have a clock on the wall with Hebrew letters. The Jewish town hall still stands in the Jewish quarter of Prague with exactly the same clock on the clock tower. So I encourage you to go visit. Okay, so that's miracle number two. The collection was there. No sooner do the Jews come back than the communists come in 1948. Communists have absolutely no need for organized religion. And the curator knew that. So she went to the new government and she said, you know, our junk is taking up 40 buildings in Prague. How about we move our stuff out of the way and you can use it for the Communist Party? And one of the first places she went to was the area where these Torah scrolls were kept. And they were moved to the outskirts of Prague to a synagogue called the Mikli Synagogue, which is actually not far from the town of Zubraslav, which is where this scroll is from. So the southern suburbia of Prague. The scrolls were put on wooden racks in this old synagogue. The roof leaked, the windows were broken, mice were running around. It was horrible conditions from 1948 to the early 1960s. This brings me to miracle number three. The communist government, strapped for cash, needed to sell hidden assets. What could they do? We have Judaica, we don't care, but those silly people in the West and those Israelis, they might care. So the government approached the Israeli government and said, do you want to buy this stuff? And the Israelis were a bit busy in the early 1960s. They said, no, we really don't have a need for that. A British art dealer happened to be in Prague on a special visa. Remember Cold War, so no information passing east to west. secret spies everywhere. Someone taps him on the shoulder and says, we have Judaica for sale. This would have been an amazing piece of news for a Brit in Prague, because the thinking by then was that everything was demolished, the people were killed, everything was bulldozed down to the ground. He came back to London and he approached a congregant at the Westminster Synagogue in Knightsbridge, London, a very posh synagogue. And this gentleman, who had bought art in the past, said, if there's anything left, we need to rescue it. He paid $20,000 American dollars at the time for the contents of the synagogue. And on a rainy day in December of 1964, now you can do your math, 2 trucks pulled up to the Westminster Synagogue and the congregants came to do a mitzvah and help unload the truck. Bag after bag after bag was unloaded. And as you can see, these are very tall Torah scrolls. Some of ours are even about a foot taller than this. Many of the congregants remarked that it felt like they were carrying body bags on the truck.
Wow.
Once that task was done, 1,564 bags lined every crevice at the Westminster Synagogue. And the congregants said, Rabbi, can we open some of the bags and see what's inside? And they did. And inside were Torah scrolls that were burnt, that were ripped, that had blood stains and bullet holes in them, and a few little notes tucked into the walls near the Eschheim in Czech or Hebrew or German that said, what's to become of us, please remember us.
Wow.
Well, this was the beginning of our organization, miracle number 4. We created the Memorial Scrolls Trust with the mission to make sure that we would preserve and never forget the Czech Jews that perished in the Holocaust, and by extension, the 6 million. And the decision was made at that time, I wasn't around, that the scrolls would be fixed up as much as possible and sent out as soon as the news broke that this horde of Torah scrolls was sent to London. Letters came pouring in. No internet, no telephone, regular letters sent through the mail, took forever. And a committee at the Westminster Synagogue decided how they could send Torah scrolls around the world. The original records are in big red loose leaf binders in the cupboard in London. We've now digitized, so it's easier for us to know all the details about where our hoard is. This scroll is from this small town south of Prague, an old Jewish town, because originally Jews weren't allowed to live in the city limits of Prague. So they gathered in the southern part in many different areas. Honestly, there were never more than a few hundred Jews in this town, but even in that whole vicinity, think 500 or something over time, dotted around in little prayer halls. The Jews there were farmers. They were feather people. They would sell feathers. They would be fowl farmers. And there were distillers and there were tavern keepers and all kinds of professions that you don't naturally think that Jews might make. And so that's our story. We've been around. The hoard came to London in 1964, and that's the 60th anniversary. And so we've been having a series of these gatherings around the world this year. New York is coming up April 7th. It will be the largest by far. I already have 65 Torah scrolls that have said they're coming with their congregants. Yes, I talked to Torah scrolls. And it's still a month ago. I think we may have about 100 of our collection in attendance and about 1,000 people at the venue. So please try to get into the city for that. I promise you, it is the most unique experience you will ever have in your life. It's very moving when you see the scrolls coming down the aisle. Today we carried 2, right? Can you imagine 100? And each one is from a town that no longer exists, a vibrant town where they would hold the Torah scroll on Shabbat morning, on Simchas Torah, dance around with it, all the bar mitzvahs that were had with this. How many people touched the Etz Chaim here? All their DNA fingerprints are still on it. How many people leaned over the scroll and chanted as beautifully as you all did this morning?
So that's a fantastic story. So one of the things I want to just remind people, correct me if I'm wrong, I just want to say, so this is not a Torah, right? That's part of Eastern Yiddish Europe, right? This is not, we think all the time it's from the shtetl, etc. It's not. And in fact, this Torah is one of 4, if I recall, that's found from the specific town, Zabraslav. And some of the dating, right, of these sea freight Torah, I was speaking to Jeffrey in London, and I know that that's sort of an issue. You're assuming that this Torah is about 150 years old, but I understand that some of those sea freight Torah, as they've investigated, may even be hundreds of years earlier than that, all the way back to the 12th century is what he suggested. Can you tell the folks about how the Torahs were marked and why they were marked?
Okay, so Torah scrolls are all written by hand with a feather quill and special secret formula ink by scribes, sofars. This tradition goes back since the beginning of time. We still write Torah scrolls that way today, no 3D printing, none of that. It takes 1 year to write an entire scroll, and it is never signed. So we don't know who wrote what scroll. It's never dedicated on the parchment. This is for this congregation. So Torah scrolls have their own secret legacy. And the only way we know is if it's verbal, Lador Vidor, passed down from generation to generation, or in this really unique moment in time where collectors filled out cards and said, this Torah scroll came from that town. Now, in the collection, a lot of little farming villages brought their collection to the next bigger farming village, and from there it came to Prague. So we're assuming it's from Zabraslav, probably is. It could be the prayer house half a kilometer down the road, but suffice it to say, it doesn't matter, because these scrolls are representing what was there. It doesn't matter whether it's from the south of Prague or the east or the west or whatever. As far as age, the scribes, not me, can look at the way the calligraphy is made and decide around when it was printed. Recently, we've been using some carbon dating to figure out a better idea of age. We have 150 scrolls that were too fragile to travel in our museum in London, which you're all welcome to visit if you're there. And the very oldest one we thought was probably from the 1400s. We carbon dated it recently to 1250. Which makes it older than the newest version of the Alt-New synagogue in Prague, which is where the golem's clay is in the attic. So maybe that scroll was actually from that synagogue when it was new, or when the rabbis were putting the clay in the attic. So when you start going down the path of what do these things represent, they represent our ancestry. These are from our ancestors. And even if you don't have a direct DNA match to somebody in the Czechlands, you do. We're all family. We're one mishpucha. And so especially when I talk to Hebrew school kids and I talk about Lador Vidor, when they do their bar mitzvah and the grandfather passes to the father and mother passes to the kid who stands proudly on the bima with the scroll, imagine that all these people from the Czechlands that danced around with these Torah scrolls, they're all here. They're up in the gallery, they're in the walls, they're in the wood, they're in the words. And now they're all part of your family. We use them for Holocaust education. I'm tasking each and every one of you. Now you know the story. Go out and tell your family the story of this. It's a miracle. It's many miracles. It's miracle upon miracle. And if we don't continue to tell that story, it'll disappear. And it's so important. It's so, so important.
Beautiful. That's fantastic. So I wanted to mention that there are a couple of short films that people can look at that will include in our next correspondence to the congregation. One is called The Tattooed Torah, which talks about some of these Sifrei Torah. And in my Shir Shel Shavua this week that I wrote about, please take a look at the musical link there as well, which talks about the journey of the Sefer Torah from Europe to America. And it's very, very moving. So from the time that Lois and I originally spoke and the time that Fred and I originally spoke to Jeff in London, which was, I think, in the summer approximately. So I had this fantastic experience, which I shared briefly with Lois. So it so happened that a couple of weeks ago, unbeknownst to me, a group of students came to visit the Lafel school. And where were they from? They were from Czechoslovakia. Amazing. So here I was speaking to these kids. We had talked about the fact that there were 120,000 Jews, right, at the height of the population. 88,000 were exterminated. Approximately 30,000 were able to escape. And then approximately 3,000 came back. this community was essentially wiped out, and here I was standing a few feet away from these Jewish kids who are relearning Hebrew. Think about Nazism, then communism, as you mentioned, which obviously prohibited the spread and the study and concentration in religion. I found it so fascinating. And then Lois says to me, oh yeah, by the way, I want to tell you something. We've also sent 2 back to that community, one to a Reformed congregation, one to an Orthodox congregation. So what's interesting to note is, yes, interfaith work for sure, Holocaust education, right? Preschool, adult ed, all of these purposes. But I was thinking about this idea. What are your thoughts about the, if you will, the revitalization of these communities? And is it a goal of the Memorial Scroll Trust to revitalize those communities? I know there are other organizations who work to revitalize various communities in Poland, etc. Can you comment on that?
So there are several thousand practicing Jews in the Czech lands now. There is a progressive community in Prague, which is growing. I think the number is 50 new congregants a month. Wow. And these are, some are expats, but some are people who were descended from Jewish grandparents that never knew it, because under communism, everybody was hiding everything. And they had their children, and then they had their children, had the grandchildren. And the grandchildren, now that the wall fell down and it's okay to talk about everything, they're finding out their grandparents were Jewish, 100%. That makes them 100%. And they're coming back and they're talking with the rabbi there, David Maxa, young guy with a family, 2 little kids, and they're learning all of it. They're learning the prayers from scratch, and they're vibrant. And if you go to Prague, you can attend a service. It's beautiful. There are also a few Orthodox communities that have started up. So we always send our scrolls out on permanent loan. That means they're ours, but we give them out and we don't want them back. And many congregations have had them for decades. We just want to know where they are. Sure. So we're the biggest decentralized museum in the world. Instead of keeping our stuff in
there's a term you use, the decentralized museum. That's what we learned today. Let me ask you a very important question. How has your thinking about the work that you do, how has it changed, if it all has at all, post October 7th?
I really wish that Holocaust education could be irrelevant in this day and age, that it was just part of what you learned in high school and everybody had tolerance for everybody else. And at least here in America, anti-Semitism would be at its lowest point in the history of the world. And clearly that's not the case, which makes scrolls like this and Holocaust education ever more relevant to get out there and talk to people, especially teenagers and children, and have them understand when they flippantly put a swastika in the boys' room of a high school, that's not nothing. That's not just graffiti. That's something really, really near and dear and disturbing to all the Jews here. And if they really understood what this survivor went through, they might think again about their simple act. And so I'm heartbroken that we're living through this day and age. And I think it's really important to get out there and keep talking.
Fantastic. Lois, I thank you so much for sharing with us about the history of the scroll. We are looking forward to sharing our first public reading of the scroll when we rededicate our Holocaust Museum upstairs. And we pray to God that we'll have the opportunity to read from this scroll also on a Shabbat close to Yom HaShoah. I'll ask you please to stay aware of your various correspondences that you received from the synagogue. But mostly, I also wanted to thank you for the work that you're doing to help preserve this legacy. It's really a great mitzvah that you're doing, as you said, not only for yourselves, but for younger generations, in the memory and the honor of past generations. Eitz Chaim Chil L'Machazikim, and you continue to be blessed with strength and blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.